Ethics and Society, and the University of Miami's Institute for Bioethics. Part of our series today, a special guest lecture, it's a real treat to be able to welcome Professor Dr. Paul Timmers. As you can see from the program announcements that have gone around, he's Research Associate at the University of Oxford, Internet Institute, a visiting professor at European University Cyprus, visiting professor at Catholic University of Leuven, and other places. Paul has been working with the EU and other organizations for a very long time, trying to capture, metabolize, educate, and coordinate issues surrounding some of the topics that are of great interest to IDISC and its constituents. More about him is elsewhere. Paul, I want to thank you again very much for joining us here at University of Miami and IDISC. Our plan is to hand the floor over to you. We're going to ask people to put questions in chat or save them till he's done, and then we'll be able to have a robust discussion and an exchange, or as we say in Miami, a sobremesa, around the table afterward. Paul, thank you so very much for being here. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ken. Thank you very much, Jelena, for inviting and introducing me. It's a great honor for me, and I find it's really very special that we can communicate in this way. I have been looking forward to it, and I hope that we can have some exchange. And talking to you from the Netherlands, I'm actually living in Belgium, but often in the UK through my affiliation with Oxford. I will talk a little bit about the European situation. So let me try and share my screen and get into the presentation. So I'll share some slides here. So hopefully you can see the slides well. I guess so. So yes. I'm going to talk about European strategic autonomy in the digital age. And where I'm coming from is a debate that has started in Europe roughly around 2017, when there were increasing concerns about sovereignty and strategic autonomy. And I'll try to explain these terms. And they are kind of at the sharp edge of that is really when we are talking about digital technologies, about chips, about quantum technologies, about cloud, etc. So sovereignty has become a top concern in Europe since about 2017 because of this kind of mix of three forces, rising international tensions, including at that time the increasing tensions between the US and Europe and China. I guess a very familiar theme for many of us. The tensions Europe and Russia, also at that time also increasing tensions in transatlantic. Actually, that has reduced now. That's one factor, and international tensions have not gone away, rather increased because we are at war. And so for us, it's very nearby. I've got a PhD student from Ukraine whose parents had to flee from the country. You have all probably many contacts with people in Ukraine. Right. You know what's happening.
I was born there. Yeah.
It's and it's really directly affecting people here. You know, people have to save on energy, rush into getting enough storage of liquid gas and that kind of thing, and kind of awaiting how it will be when the weather gets colder, and who knows what is going to happen just, let's say, 1,000 kilometers to the east, where Putin is threatening, including with nuclear weapons. Now, that also is quite interesting in the other force, the digital transformation and dominance. That is something that is radically changing ways of living, as everybody, of course, knows, but also ways governments are operating, the ways democracy is exerted. And the dominance is really an issue in Europe, that a lot of the technology is coming from the United States or China. And the big tech companies are not European companies, they are companies from other parts of the world. And then the global threats. So I already mentioned war, but the other kind of global threats are cybercrime, for example, spanning across, ignoring completely, of course, borders between countries, climate change, like same story, COVID, the pandemic, and others that are coming. So altogether, governments were feeling that they were losing control. They were losing the grip on sovereignty. Now, sovereignty is perhaps a word that for some has perhaps not such a positive connotation, because it can be associated to all kind of things of over state control or what have you. But actually, I will explain how we are looking at it here at sovereignty. So the sovereignty gap is not only, or is amongst others, that the international systems of states gets upset, because there is a constant erosion of the capability of states and infrastructures through cyber attacks and those kind of things. You get actors that don't play by the rules at all anymore. We saw North Korea, but now we see also Russia, Iran, that are not playing by the usual rules. And then there are also new entrants, in a certain sense, groups that are using cyber digital technologies to upset the international system of states, but also these new actors like the global tech platforms that to some extent are taking over tasks that previously belonged to governments and in the sovereign domain. For example, the identification of citizens. Now, sovereignty is a pretty old term, and it comes kind of from 14th, 15th, 16th, 17th century. And at that time, in the 17th century, there was a long-lasting battle that cost the lives of millions in Europe between all kind of kingdoms and princelates and smaller states, which was ultimately settled in a peace, or the Peace of Westphalia, and that established two treaties that kind of established the system of states, the system of sovereign states. And philosophers, political scientists that have worked a lot on that include Bodin, who started to define what sovereignty is actually about, and that there can be a sovereign, which later got identified with the state, the sovereign state. Hobbes, who talked about the social contract, the relationship between the state and the citizens. And Rousseau, who brought in things like popular democracy. And that's the way we see in the democratic part of the world actually what sovereignty is about. There's a democratic relationship between citizens and the state. Now, at that time, you see many, many different countries and smaller states in Europe that has, of course, ultimately over many centuries evolved into something that is the European Union, the EU today. So 27 member states. And a lot of collaboration between these 27, also based upon law. And these law are treaties. So they are giving the basis for collaboration in the economic domain, in the domain of consumer and citizen interest, and even also into domains like international collaboration and trade. And one of those domains where you see that Europe is jointly active as these 27 member states is something as simple as the .eu domain name. You know, the .eu domain name is actually something that is really allocated to the European Union and is managed jointly. And it's something that shows that you can have, if you work together with a number of countries, that you can have something that is more than just the sum of these individual countries, because each country has, of course, its own domain name. But then on top of that, you have .eu. And what it brings is an identity. Your websites can be called .eu. So my website, for example, is called iv.eu. It is an added value across the European Union because you are recognized as being from the European Union. But it also gives Europe a position in the world because on that basis of this joint domain management, you can collaborate in organizations like ICANN and have a voice there that are managing domain names across the world. So you see that working together between 27 member states does not always need to mean that you have to give up your national sovereignty. The .eu goes beyond that for national sovereignty, and no one loses national sovereignty on that. And another example is the COVID pass that you see on the screen here, which is about the possibility to travel around, of course, with your COVID vaccination certificate. And that COVID pass is something that is introduced all across Europe, and now actually is also recognized worldwide by 60 countries and more than 1 billion people who can use the EU COVID pass. So sovereignty, a few of these terms, let's define them, or let's try. You cannot really define them because they are probably, sovereignty is probably an essentially contested concept, as a philosopher once said, but it's certainly about power. How do you distribute power in a country? Who has the authority? Is this authority also recognized? And this recognition is quite important because it's the internal legitimacy, which means the recognition of the government by its citizens and the recognition of the citizens by the government. So the government needs to be legitimate, and we express that in democracy in our countries. And external legitimacy means that a state, a country is recognized by third countries, that it has that. And that is not a given, that's not self-evident and can be contested over time. So Russia does not recognize the sovereignty of Ukraine. And so in the eyes of Russia, Ukraine has no external legitimacy, but it certainly has external legitimacy for us. So what it is about is a bit vague. You know, it's certainly, you think of territory, you think of people, you think of natural resources, you think of values and culture. That's all part of sovereignty. That is what belongs to us. But nowadays, we would probably also say that the digital resources belong to us, at least some of them. So health data, for example, or genetic data, and Ken knows probably a lot about that, are felt to belong to us. We own them. They are part of our sovereignty. Now, all nice words, a concept which is not strictly defined and always evolving, but to realize sovereignty, you need to have strategic autonomy. And strategic autonomy is really actually a term that comes from the military domain, meaning that you have the capabilities, you have the capacities and the control to realize your sovereignty. And so you need to be able to know something, you know something, you can do something, you have the capability sufficient capability to do something, you have sufficient control thereover to, for example, defend your territory, defend or guard your digital and natural resources, to safeguard your legitimacy, etc. And the focal point that I have here is really about strategic autonomy. So strategic autonomy is, you recognize, probably for people from the military domain, you recognize this type of terminology about capacity and capabilities. Now, if you want to realize strategic autonomy, how can you actually do it? And there are kind of 4 ways to do it. Talking to many people in my research, there are 4 ways that come up. You can do it all on your own, autarky. So try to be self-sufficient. And we know that that is very hard. Perhaps in the digital domain, perhaps ultimately the United States and China would be able to be self-sufficient, even if they perhaps may not think it's completely desirable to do so. But certainly for Europe, Europe is too small, too divided. It cannot do everything on its own. So in the European context, there are other approaches that you are followed. You can kind of do the best under a risk management approach to defend your sovereignty, to have sufficient strategic autonomy, to be strong in whether it is in health strategic autonomy or digital strategic autonomy or defense or finance or materials or finance, other kind of areas, whatever you may want to mention, and hope for the best. But it's a bit risky because actually when you talk about risks to sovereignty, you're talking about risks to the state. You're talking about national security and economic security. So you can also do and try to realize strategic autonomy by working together with others in strategic partnerships of like-minded parties, being realistic, because often then there are still external dependencies outside such a strategic partnership. And you can also try to realize and safeguard your sovereignty and have your strategic autonomy by working globally together. And so global collaboration, actually moving some of the challenges, the threats to your sovereignty, moving that to the global level may be a smart strategy for some things. So we do it, for example, for domain name systems. But there is another example that we know from the past. So perhaps some people recognize this. So this is the hole in the ozone layer. And the hole in the ozone layer was a threat for every country. So everybody's sovereignty was threatened by the hole in the ozone layer. And ultimately, there were scientists and a number of enlightened politicians that got together and developed an international agreement called the Montreal Protocol that was agreed in 1987 to close the hole in the ozone layer by banning the CFCs, the gases that were destroying the ozone. And that actually worked, but it took a long time. It's only now, 30 years later, that we are starting to see the whole closing. And so that's a way to work together globally to actually help everybody in their sovereignty. No one is threatened by that, but the joint threat is ultimately countered. But you have to be patient. Global common approaches take a long time. So there's a lot of talk about strategic autonomy at the European level, and there's a lot of talk internationally also about it. And there are some of these fallacies that you hear, like, some people see strategic autonomy as a way to be protectionist. But sensible politicians don't talk about protectionism in this area. If you hear the term protectionism, it's usually more used in a somewhat manipulative sense for the debate, but it's not really the case that protectionism is a desired strategy, because people are more realistic. You can't realize your strategic autonomy by being protectionist. The other thing is we can have it all. I already mentioned digital strategic autonomy, financial, health, materials. You can go on. That's a lot to do. And doing everything or having it all is probably unrealistic if you look at how much money it will all cost to realize all these capacities, the production capacities, have all the knowledge to safeguard your strategic autonomy. So you need to be pretty realistic in this. And there is another kind of thing in strategic autonomy, that's the kind of let's take back control slogan, which was used in Brexit, which was actually shot down very eloquently by Martin Wolf of the Financial Times, who said, you cannot take back control on something that you never had. So, there's some talk in Europe of people who say, let's take back control on cloud, on the basic cloud. Well, Europe was never strong in basic cloud. So there is not a matter of let's take back control. It's rather a matter of looking at the future of cloud services and trying to be a player in the future cloud services. So some fallacies and also some risks if you start talking about strategic autonomy. It's like the hammer. If once you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. So everything can be labeled with strategic autonomy, and you can really go overboard with that. It has been a bit of a debate. How do you demarcate, how do you limit the debate on strategic autonomy? So if you want to, I will give some examples later, but if you want to protect yourselves against the pandemic like COVID-19, do you really need to have vaccine strategic autonomy? Or would you rather say that's just a resilience? Well, it's an important one, but it's actually a resilience issue. We need to create resilience, which is different from having the full control, ultimately, even if it is with partners, on everything in terms of capabilities and capacities. And also, government plays quite an important role in strategic autonomy, because it's about state, the country, national sovereignty, national security. But government, let's be realistic, they have limited capabilities and capacities. And strategic autonomy is complex. There are often many factors that play a role. In the EU in particular, there's only a limited number of measures that you can take. The EU has a limited mandate. So to give an explicit example, when things are about national security, and the EU wants to touch national security, actually the treaties, which is the legal basis for the European Union, say that national security remains the prerogative of the countries, of the member states. So if you want to do something in national security at European level, you really need to have everybody to come along from the national level. And that's not self-evident. And then often people are talking about a Brussels effect. There's lots of rules that are established in Brussels and they have a worldwide effect. But there can also be a Beijing effect. So here we are also up to looking at what is the influence that is coming from China in setting rules and norms across the world. Rules and norms that are perhaps a threat for strategic autonomy in the United States and in Europe. Now, let's move to the digital side. So in digital sovereignty is actually digital strategic autonomy. It's really having enough capabilities and capacities in the technologies that make up the digital world. But there are so many of them. It really goes from the key enabling technologies, semiconductors, quantum, levels up to 5G, 6G, cloud computing, the platforms, the digital platforms, up to sovereign electronic identity, blockchain, and ultimately integration in application environments and use cases from Industry 4.0 to the metaverse. And so there is so much that you can consider as being pretty important for your sovereignty. That's pretty important to safeguard your economy, the jobs of the future, to safeguard your society, to make sure that your democracy is not threatened. There's really a lot that you need to keep in your hands. And so there's a dilemma of choice. What do you actually then work on? And that dilemma has not been resolved. I think we can perhaps talk about it. What do you think are priorities to address? Would you rather say, look at the platforms and try to keep a grip on the digital platforms like the social media? Or would you say, no, more important is that the basic technologies, that you have a good control on those? And there is another kind of dilemma in Europe. This is a complicated diagram, which I will just give the essence of it. In Europe, Europe is very dependent on technologies that are coming from outside. And so there's a study that is into the Digital Dependency Index, which actually tells how dependent are countries in their hardware, software, and services on other countries. And you see here on the left-hand side how this dependency has changed over the last 10 years. And you see at the bottom, China -12. China has become far less dependent than other countries on the rest of the world. And obviously, the rest of the world is mainly dependency on the United States. Japan has become more dependent. The European countries have mostly stayed as dependent as they were 10 years ago. So they have not yet advanced that much in terms of their strategic autonomy, reducing their dependency. And the other, at the right-hand side, is the change of the autonomy gap relative to the United States over the last 10 years. And there too, you see that China has been able to reduce a dependency on the United States, but many countries have actually become more dependent on the United States. And main reason for that is I think cloud services and social media, digital platforms. So now a bit of a big diagram. If you look over time, I said already around 2017, this strategic autonomy debate came up because of the geopolitical threats, the digital transformation, and global threats. And so you can imagine that in the past, there was actually very little attention for strategic autonomy. The word actually didn't really appear in European vocabulary, but what did appear was things like resilience, and resilience is a necessary but not sufficient condition for your sovereignty. If you are not resilient, you can forget about your sovereignty at all, but perhaps you want to be not only resilient, but you also want to have it under your own control. Now, in the past, and I worked on that myself, there was a critical infrastructures cyber law, which we call in the European law jargon NIS1, the Network and Information Security Law. And that was really focused on making sure that critical infrastructures like water, transport, electricity would not be going down because of cyber attacks. And that was a risk management approach. Later, the debate came up on strategic autonomy, and we got the 5G security debate, which perhaps some people know a lot about, which was, can you still buy Huawei equipment? And that was already much more about the threat to governments of buying equipment on 5G that would contain Chinese hardware and software. So then you're talking about the risks of espionage, and that you start to get very close to national security, so to full sovereignty. And there were initiatives coming up on cloud and on new initiatives on cybersecurity that already became much more sovereignty oriented. Rather recently, in the last 2 years, proposals have come up around platforms, the Digital Markets Act, regulating access to the digital platforms, social media, for example, and cloud services, and also the content of what is happening on social media, the Digital Services Act. And together with digital wallet law, which is about your digital identity, but then combined with a digital wallet in which you have your COVID pass, your driver's license, your professional certification, etc. That's a big development around getting more grip on what is considered quite essential in a country, namely, who are your citizens and what are the rights of your citizens? And the rights of your citizens are, in a sense, contained in the digital wallet. And it's said this is really something where governments need to be involved. And then the most recent things are around the EU Chips Act that I'll tell a bit more about. EU Defense Fund. Well, if you talk about defense, you're clearly talking about strategic autonomy and sovereignty, and the Data Act. And happy to say a bit more about any of these pieces of legislation. So that's actually stuff that is all on the table, laws, investment, collaboration, standards, etc., regulations that are either already decided or in the process of political negotiation. And just very recently, a Cyber Resilience Act was put in place, which is about, you might say, essentially ICT supply chain security. So the topic that got a lot of attention with, for example, the SolarWinds ransomware attack. Sorry, there was kind of not a ransomware. So yeah, the SolarWinds espionage attack. Already announces that now, for example, Europe and also the United States are very dependent on other countries, in particular China, again, for certain critical materials, rare earths. And reducing that dependency is going to be subject of a future initiative that will come soon. So you see kind of the line is to get gradually from just resilience to full sovereignty. That's kind of the general trend. And my impression is this debate about strategic autonomy is not going to go away for the next 10 years, because just the external threats, the geopolitics will continue to be very important. So let me say a little bit about the EU Chips Act as a main example of a strategic autonomy initiative. And I'm kind of to spend a few minutes on that, and then I will conclude. So I took this initiative because of all of the initiatives. This is a recent one, which is also pretty much really, as I said before, it's at that upper right corner. It's very much about strategic autonomy, about creating more bases, more safeguards for your sovereignty, and now then about semiconductors. And there's an EU Chips Act, there's a US Chips and Science Act. Actually, all of the major economies are having a significant attention now for semiconductors. So semiconductors is a complex industry. The value chain includes, of course, what we call what attracts most attention, the semiconductor manufacturing, the fabs. But they are thriving upon chip design, and that needs sophisticated design tools and intellectual property. They, in the fab, will have to combine that and etch it onto silicon wafers, and with a lot of different and complex materials that go into that. There has to be manufacturing equipment to ultimately produce the wafers and to print or the chips, you might say, assembly, test, and packaging. And this is all fed by research and development. And then ultimately, only the chips go to the OEMs, like an Apple, putting it in an iPhone, or a car manufacturer that puts it in a car. And I think everybody knows that a car nowadays contains many, many chips. Even your coffee maker contains more than 10 chips. And so there are complex interactions between companies. So there are a wide variety of activities and complex interactions between those that are producing semiconductors. For example, ASML is a big one from Europe. The foundries, which are the fabs like TSMC in Taiwan. The fabless manufacturers that are ordering the chips like NVIDIA, Broadcom, Qualcomm, that are ultimately also then producing the end products, and others that play a role here. And striking is this cooperation between companies of very different sorts. So it's an industry that's very much used to relationships and cooperations. And also that this is happening globally. So over the years, the semiconductor industry has become a global industry. For all kinds of reasons, it turned out to be best to distribute these various functions and not to do geographic concentration. Well, geography and territory and sovereignty and strategic autonomy, of course, all belong together. So the industry is actually really kind of 90 degrees in a different direction from what you might say is the direction of geopolitics and sovereignty and strategic autonomy, because it distributes all across the world. And this is just an example, a small example of the components for an iPhone Pro board that are coming from the States, from Europe, from China, well, from other parts in Asia. So there are global interdependencies. And these global interdependencies have been upset recently, also have led to chip supply chain crisis. Now, back to Europe. So Europe is worried because Europe realizes that over the years, like the United States, by the way, its share in semiconductor manufacture in particular has been reducing. So the States, I think, went from 30% to about 10%. Europe went from about 25% to only 7% in the middle of this, which is semiconductor manufacturing. And the other figures in black that are indicated here are the added value that is happening in this particular activity. Europe is also not so much present in chip design, certainly not in the design tools and the IP that are largely actually coming from the United States, a bit more present in materials and silicon wafers, and relatively well present in manufacturing equipment. And the big equipment manufacturer there that was also the last few days in the news is ASML in the Netherlands. So Europe's position is not only not so strong, but also has been getting weaker in the fabs, in the manufacturing over the years. And the feeling is this is creating a real challenge for ultimately the future of the economy and society in Europe as semiconductors go into any economic activity, and you need to at least have some grip on this. Now, this got more severe as a worry when we got the supply chain crisis, the chip supply crisis that hit us since last year, and actually led to it that, for example, car manufacturing had to be stopped in a number of cases. So you see this, the issues, and listing here some of the issues in semiconductors. The shrinking share of the USA, the European Union, Japan also, especially in fabs, and they have been largely concentrated in Taiwan and South Korea. And then this chip supply chain crisis, which kind of came on top of another supply chain crisis that we just had, which was during the time of the pandemic, the vaccines production. So another crisis that showed that if you have a very large external dependency and something goes wrong, you can get into big trouble. And today in Europe, we have actually an energy supply chain crisis because Putin is cutting off the supply of the gas, and we are trying to restore at least a degree of strategic autonomy in energy. I already showed that there are also these dependencies, these geographic international dependencies in the industrial ecosystem. And there are also these dependencies, the many dependencies between companies. And so you have dependencies that are of various natures simply because of the type of thing we are talking about. Chips are complex and have many dependencies. The geographic, because the industry has been globalizing. And also within that within that global system, there are friends and others that are perhaps less so a friend. So there is a dependency between like-minded partners, but there are also remaining dependencies with others. The industry is very sensitive to capital. There's very large capex is needed, very sensitive to skills and talent. So if you read, for example, TSMC, that is now investing a lot in the United States, their main worry is actually the supply of talent, enough skilled people that can be good in chips manufacturing. A lot of technology development, very interesting. All kind of new technologies are coming up, but that means you need to also stay at the edge. You need to stay in front of this technology development if you want to have strategic autonomy. And sustainability issues coming up, because this is not a clean industry. It's an industry that uses a lot of energy, a lot of water, a lot of space, a lot of risk for pollution. So the planet also needs to be taken care of when we talk about semiconductors. Now, So semiconductors was an important area, and the European Commission, which is the lawmaker in Europe, the law proposer actually in Europe, proposed an EU Chips Act. Pretty similar actually to the US Chips Act. And as they say, to confront the semiconductor shortages, so the supply crisis, and to strengthen Europe's technological leadership. That happened in February of this year. And the Chips Act has 3 pillars. A Chips for Europe, which is about research and development and pilots. So it's kind of the front end of it. Then the fabs, the middle part, actually the production. And then you have a monitoring and crisis response mechanism to deal with shortages. Very briefly, this pillar 1, the Chips for Europe initiative, is about research and development, substantial investment in that. For example, in quantum technologies, for quantum for chips, photonics, less than 2 nanometer designs, design software, production pilot lines, where you can start trying out the next generation of production before it actually goes into the fab. Virtual design platforms, meaning people can work together and share design tooling and work together on designs. And there's a large collaboration that involves 28 countries, including, for example, Israel is part of that, and then 25 European countries that collaborate on these kind of issues that I mentioned here. Then there is the bigger financial part. It's called security of supply. It's a bit of an odd name, but it's actually the fab part. So this has an investment of about $30 billion. Which leverages further private investment. An estimated total of more than 160 billion might come out, but that's not guaranteed because you never know if this leveraging actually works. And this is in integrated production facilities. So these are companies like, for example, Intel that is doing from beginning to end. So it's producing for itself, and there are open foundries that are fabs that can work for others. And by the way, Intel is actually the largest investor in Europe. And they have promised, I think, now to invest, I believe, $68 billion over the next 10 years in European fabs. There's also about making it easier to get money from states, so state aids, and there has to be a first-of-a-kind criterion, meaning that, for example, you can only get money under this scheme or favorite investment conditions if you do innovation, for example, in substrate material, in higher efficiency, so low energy consumption, increased performance, less load on the environment, or substantial integration in packaging. So there has to be there has to be a demonstration that this is first of a kind. So it's not just any kind of production that can qualify. And the last part, the monitoring and crisis response, actually under the assumption that it will not be the last time that we're going to get a semiconductor chip supply crisis. So you need to monitor what is happening, you need to understand your supply chain, and you need to also be able to intervene. And that includes, for example, that those companies that are getting investment support, so the Pillar 2 companies, the fabs, can be asked to produce specific chips in crisis situations. So there's a supply obligation. So this whole initiative, if I now compare this very briefly and very superficially, I must say, between what is happening in the US and in the EU, then in the EU, you see the total budget is about 43 billion, but there will be a leverage. And so the leverage might be about 4 times as much through leveraging into state aid support and also private support. In the EU, you see a network of competence centers that addresses the skills shortage. You see this R&D in topics like quantum and less than 2 nanometer chips and low power chips. And special for Europe is that there is also a risk capital fund set up to help smaller companies. So different, as you know, probably from the United States, where there is plenty risk capital. There's less risk capital in Europe, certainly for the smaller companies. And so the idea is that you help the smaller companies to scale up by creating this risk capital fund. Now, in the US, again, a very superficial comparison, the budget appears to be larger. There's 53 billion, and there are also tax credits. but effectively to how much it works out, it might be comparable. It might be comparable. The subtlety is here in the types of investments that are happening and the leverage that is happening, the way you can actually create a multiplication factor out of the, let's say, state investment, the national or the European investment. And there are also regional tech hubs that also address skills, research and development, probably kind of similar topics, but a bit differently formulated. In the US, more around wireless, AI, next generation computing. And special in the US is that the US has introduced guardrails as regard China. So companies that are getting support have to accept restrictions in their dealings with China. And this is not something that you have in Europe. So you see, this is really geopolitics. This is where Europe and the United States, who actually want to work together in this area, they have also a transatlantic agreement on that. And the European approach is clearly very open to US presence. I said already, Intel is the largest investor in Europe in semiconductors. They may still get into, let's say, diplomatically into discussions as regards China. So this is an initiative that actually really increases capabilities, increases capacities, fabs, for example, increases control. It's also happening in a partnership. So it's under the heading of a strategic partnership because EU and US are collaborating in these kind of things. But there are many buts that are raised. You know, is it a perfect type of approach? By far not, probably, because it might be that the total investment needs are much larger. So for Europe and probably also for the US, likewise, the total investment needs in order to get back to the levels of presence in production that we had in the past, maybe around 300 billion. You know, so that's a lot more than the amounts that we see here. There may be subsidy raises. You know, is the EU or US, are they offering more? Are companies going to choose for either the European Union or the United States, or perhaps for Japan or South Korea or Taiwan, who are offering also a lot? Is this actually an efficient way of working? Or are we destroying specialization, which is actually one of the landmarks of this being such a fantastic industry? If everybody wants to do their own thing, are we going to have a lot of duplication? And in all realism, there will be remaining choke points. There will be dependencies that are outside the EU and United States on materials, for example. And what are we going to do about those? They can be geopoliticized, they can become securitized, as they say, they can get militarized, they can become a geopolitical tool. And we will have to sort out. So let me finish. If you look at geopolitics of strategic autonomy, it has to be taken seriously. It concerns countries, obviously, countries in the way they make their rules, but also the way they do their own government, the way they organize their democracy, which can be undermined. And they are, of course, international actors. Companies are very much affected ever more by geopolitics, whether they want it or not. They are feeling it as a company in itself, but also as a partner in the industrial ecosystem. They may get rules imposed, but they can also get very attractive incentives that pull them in one direction or the other, but perhaps with strings attached, like the guardrails on China. So some companies are also really geopolitical actors. They are so large in this. When I talk, for example, about the digital platforms. And then ultimately citizens, because this is really citizens in their own autonomy, through which they express the legitimacy of democracy, their own control on data and their identity, the digital selves that they will have already now, but even more so in the metaverse, for example. So my conclusion is this. Let me skip this. We have a sovereignty challenge. Whether we like the word or not, it's here to stay. It's a lot about national security, economic security, safeguarding democracy. The threats are not going to disappear likely in the next 10 years or so. And it's really, I think we feel it's about our freedom. And when you are in Europe, you feel It's really about our freedom. It's very nearby. We've got the Ukrainian refugees here in our own neighborhood. So you know what is, you can start increasingly see what is at stake. So in 2017, you couldn't really use the word sovereignty. It was a bit of a forbidden word. Now, everybody knows much clearer what sovereignty is about. Now, Europe is starting to get surprisingly its act more together, and it's probably because there are so many crises. So decision-making is faster in Europe, more coherent, and more in areas that used to be difficult, like national security. And digital is really the trailblazer of this whole debate about strategic autonomy. It's about much more. It's also about energy. It's also about financial. It's about health, strategic autonomy. But digital is kind of showing the way. And I've given you one example, the CHIPS Act, our CHIPS Acts in the US and in Europe, that are kind of showing what do we actually mean by strategic autonomy in terms of these capacities, capabilities, and control. So I hand back to you. I hope that that this was a rapid, but hopefully a clear overview, and I'm open for any questions. And I propose I stop sharing my screen.
Thank you so much, Paul, for a phenomenal talk. And I'll turn it over to Ken, who is going to moderate the questions. Ken, all yours.
Thanks, Elena. Paul, thank you for a brilliant talk. While we're waiting for questions, and people can either raise their hands or put something in chat, let me ask the first one. So many sovereignties has created a challenge for the world for, well, most of the history of the world. What you point out, though, is really striking, and the citizens, at the end of the day, and your closing remark, I think, was a really important signal to send. At the end of the day, if we do value the kind of liberties we're used to in Europe and the US, if not in China and Russia, and we are in some sense dependent on lots of companies' business plans, which of course is I don't begrudge any company doing something useful and selling it, right? That's fine with me. But what you point out is we have a geopolitical challenge here of the first magnitude. I'm hoping against hope that Brussels and Washington are talking to each other a lot. Are they?
Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say, are Brussels and Washington?
Let me say a bit about the way they are talking to each other. So I will be next week in Washington for a discussion on transatlantic collaboration adjacent to the what is called the Transatlantic Trade and Technology Council. And that is really an initiative that has developed over the past few years with the intention to work together in quite a number of critical areas. This includes artificial intelligence, data, and cybersecurity, ICT supply chain security, as well as semiconductors. And let's say from the political intention, it's clear that we are talking here about a collaboration of like-minded partners. But that's kind of like the difference between strategic intent and the strategic plan. You can have the same strategic intent, but then you get to the real plan, and the real plan includes hard stuff. That's about money. That's about who does what. That's about standards. And that's where the going gets tough. So constantly, I think it's necessary to remind ourselves, the political level is reminded that there's something bigger happening than what is an individual company or an individual country. There's a real sparse collaboration. This may mean that we do get in conflict with what companies actually want. So, yeah, working. So sometimes companies to go for global presence rather than being constrained by governments. And I think there is this whole debate about, is it the end of globalization, what is happening now? Well, certainly there are limits to globalization that you see consequences of this whole geopolitization, whether we like it or not.
I don't know. So should I be encouraged or should I be worried?
Yeah,
Both.
I think it's I think we should all be pretty worried. That's my view. You know, there's so much that, let's say, we, for example, as scientists see that should be possible, but of course we are already starting to feel the restrictions of what you actually can do. There's so much that companies see as an opportunity in the global world, but you see de facto that they run into the constraints, and these are nasty constraints. So one of the pleas that I make is that we do not use this hammer of strategic autonomy for everything, and not in the narrow sense. We should actually really think about it, in which areas can we go for global solutions, because, you know, all of the things we have been talking about now, we will need also to tackle global challenges like climate change. And climate change, to be impolite, doesn't give a damn about geopolitics and national borders. It's touching all of that. Pandemics, likewise. So there's actually quite a lot of opportunity to define solutions at a global level. So even take something difficult like 5G or 6G security, you can think, we as scientists and people that are working on technology, we can think of architectures that actually isolate the core issues around sovereignty, around national security, such that for the larger part, we can have global communications without being worried. Meaning we do need to have a standardization strategy between Europe and the United States on going global with our standards as much as possible. And that's just a better offer.
I'm going to keep asking questions if no one else does. Let me just in passing mention, so while you're doing this work, remember there are colleagues in Europe and North America and China and South America who are thinking about ethical issues related to information technology construed broadly. You've described a tension between interdependency and sovereignty. I mean, in some sense, the nut of the problem, if I'm not mistaken, is that kind of a bifurcated set of values, and we manage those better or less well. As you meet your colleagues in Brussels and Washington, remind them there's a world community of people who, a diverse community of people. I think you probably, if there were an election, you'd be elected. But in terms of the relationship between ethics, technology, and policy, or among ethics, technology, and policy, you've mapped out a great challenge. I don't think most people in the world of information technology ethics think much about semiconductor manufacturers, right? And yet, in many important respects, how the research that's done, the uses to which the appropriate uses and users, which we talk about in terms of, you know, decision support systems in AI, and in fact, prior to AI, is a great model perhaps for this. What's an appropriate way to move forward in this environment? And who will listen, and how can we help? How can we support the work of people of goodwill who are doing this around the world?
One of the things that I also find quite interesting is there are areas where you can actually say there is a real common interest, where you have also an opportunity to develop that common understanding, even if we are coming from different cultural backgrounds. So let me give an example. During the pandemic, we saw this very nasty phenomenon that hospitals got attacked by cybercrime, by cyber criminals. Now, we are all interested in public health all across the world. We are all scared of, or certainly fearful that cybercrime will paralyze our hospitals. So wouldn't it be wise to work together on such a topic, like let's say secure public health worldwide? And actually, we do have also organizations that can help us for that. And indeed, I'm glad that I start now to see some signs that there are pilots. People are talking internationally to do precisely that. Well, then you have somewhere a starting point where you can say we can develop a common understanding about the do's and the don'ts, not being naive, because we will not get on the same on the same line if it is about democracy, I guess. But also there's a lot more than only that area to talk about when we talk about the development of common approaches. And I think that's also where we then can see what do we mean, for example, about AI and ethics in very particular situations, because we will need AI to protect our hospitals. We will need AI to get the max value out of the data that we are collecting in order to fight a pandemic.
Last question is going to come from me again if no one else volunteers.
Ask a question. Hi, Paul.
Hi.
Hi, I'm Robert Plant. I'm the Chair of Business Technology in the Miami Herbert Business School. I just wanted to ask you if you could briefly comment on China's position on sovereignty and their response to the movement from the West's position as it changes, how you see the balance, as you talked about globalization and de-globalization, that is currently one of these moving tectonic plates that we see.
Yeah. Well, if in the debate about norms and values, which is happening at UN level, China was one of the first to actually start talking about sovereignty in cyberspace, but they meant something completely different with that than we actually intended to say, because as I said before, for us, sovereignty is legitimized through democracy. And that's clearly not the view of China. Moreover, China has been translating its approach to sovereignty as increasingly an autarkic approach, going on its own. And so the dual circulation approach is actually an inner circulation in the economy, where the outer part of the economy may just help to get internal control increased. So China is really not on the same page as we are when we are starting from the perspective on sovereignty. At the same time, of course, we cannot ignore that we have got great dependencies on China, and these dependencies are actually mutual. So there is a degree of reciprocity. And the degree of reciprocity is always a basis to still continue talking and doing business, but perhaps also to get to certain agreements. So my personal view, and that's certainly not shared by everybody, is that I think we need to really look ahead. Also as scientists, we need to imagine ourselves what is the world in 2035, when these global challenges are not going to go away, and we will need to find a way to deal with that. So I think we need to think carefully, very carefully about our continued collaboration with China, and also as we look forward to some of the very big challenges. I can very well understand that for now we are saying, well, we should really reinforce our own position because the dependency is too large. And we want to give a clear signal that we can be largely independent when it is immediately about a thing like semiconductors. But when we are talking about the applied areas like public health and like climate, we will have to find a modus vivendi. Yeah.
Robert, thank you for that opportunity for Paul to bring this all home. It ends on a positive, forward-looking note. When you're a hammer, everything's a nail, of course. So you'll forgive me for mentioning ethics, but I think it can be a universal donor. Thank you so very much. Elena, would you like the last word?
No, well, I know Paul for 30 years. I had the privilege to meet him at G7 meetings where I represented US, and Paul was a big boss from European Union. So I'm sure we find a way to chat and follow up on these amazing discussions very soon. And Paul, please send me your schedule. Maybe we'll intersect in Washington, and very much looking forward to host you in Miami and see what we can do together, because definitely your amazing expertise and experience would be more than welcome in our institute at the University of Miami. So let's figure out how we can reconnect and start to work together.
Thank you. And let me say I'm very grateful to you and happy that you have been listening to me. And let's absolutely stay in contact. The more collaboration, the better. And the more friendship, the better. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Bye, guys. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.